Get off my property, Commander. This house belongs to your sister now. You're not welcome here anymore. That was my father's cold verdict, and it hit me like a blade to the ribs. I had just walked home after 3 exhausting weeks of non-stop training, dragging my worn-out body up the path, only to find him and my sister Olivia laughing together, clinking champagne glasses on the rooftop deck of the very house I owned. He jabbed a finger at my dust-covered uniform and sneered. "The Navy takes care of you now," he said. "This place is going to Olivia and her husband." My duffel bag dropped from my grip and hit the ground with a thud. More than $110,000 I had poured into supporting him, and this is how he repaid me, with theft, dressed up as a family decision. I swallowed the insult, forced a cold smile, nodded once, and walked away without a word. They had no clue that by the time they hauled their suitcases through that door a few days later, I'd already prepared a reception for them, 6 stages of psychological reckoning designed to bring those 2 greedy leeches to their knees, pleading for it to end. Before I continue, if this story feels familiar to you, consider liking and following, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I peeled out of my own driveway, my hands clenched so hard around the wheel my knuckles turned bone white. Gravel spit under the tires, a harsh sound that matched the ripping sensation inside my chest. I would not cry. Instead, the smug pop of that champagne cork replayed over and over in my head, hauling me back through 15 years of being drained dry. That sound, the sound of luxury I never asked for and never got, snapped something open in my memory. It took me back to the first moment I understood that my father didn't see a daughter he was proud of. He saw a wallet with legs. I remembered shivering in my barracks during an early deployment, choking down flavorless field rations while staring at a bank statement that turned my stomach. My combat pay, every bit of it, had been quietly funneled into funding his comfortable life back home. Money I earned through sleep-deprived convoy runs down roads where one miscalculation meant a body bag, gone, without so much as a thank you, without a single call to ask if I was still breathing. The ghost of that champagne seemed to hang in my car's vents, souring the air. It smelled like betrayal. I gripped the wheel tighter and merged onto the empty highway. My mind dragged up the day I handed over $35,000 in cash for a brand new SUV because my unemployed sister and her deadbeat husband refused to ride the bus like everyone else. I remembered standing in that blinding dealership showroom, running on no sleep after a 2-day shift, passing Olivia the keys. She didn't say thank you. Not once. She just huffed, adjusted her sunglasses, and complained loudly to the mortified salesman that the leather wasn't the exact beige she wanted. She rolled her eyes at me like I'd personally wronged her. My father stood behind her, arms crossed, nodding along with her complaint. He never once told her to be grateful. He acted like my combat pay was his birthright to hand out to his favorite child, and my only function in this family was to keep the money coming. The dark road matched the darkening memories. I recalled a call that came a few months before the SUV incident, the middle of the night, while I was overseas managing a classified fuel logistics operation. My father's voice, shaking and desperate, begging for $25,000 to settle gambling debts before dangerous people came for him. No apology. No admission that he needed help. Just a threat that his blood pressure would spike and kill him, leaving my sister an orphan, as if his self-made disaster were somehow my emergency. He didn't care that I was in a restricted zone, that the call itself put me at risk. I broke protocol, risking discipline from my superiors and possibly compromising an active mission, just to wire him the money through an unsecured channel in time. The next morning my commanding officer asked me directly why I'd accessed a civilian financial system during a communications blackout. I lied to cover for him. I put my career on the line for a man who lost money in illegal card games while I coordinated multi-million-dollar supply routes in a war zone. I paid for his mistakes with money I bled for and a reputation I spent a decade building, and he repaid all of it by stealing the one place I called home. I pulled the car onto the gravel shoulder of the mountain road and threw it into park. My chest heaved against the seatbelt. The full scope of what I'd lost, over $110,000 extracted under the banner of family loyalty, pressed down on me like an anchor. I hit the dashboard with my fist, once, twice, a third time. The sound matched the thud of my duffel bag hitting the villa floor an hour earlier. The tears refused to come. Years of training had beaten that reflex out of me. Instead, my grief hardened into something cold and focused, a clarity that cut through 15 years of blind devotion. I owed these people nothing. Not a dollar, not a tear, not another shred of my dignity. The family tie was severed. I put the car in drive and pushed forward into the night. Hours later, back in my quiet San Diego apartment, the silence greeted me like held breath. I set my keys down with a sharp clink, my eyes drifting to the folded flag resting in its glass case on the mantel, placed there by the chaplain 3 years earlier, the creases still sharp, still carrying the weight of a nation's gratitude that my own family never once matched. I stepped toward it, fingers grazing the frame, and the memory of James's funeral crashed into me. The crack of the 21-gun salute. The stone faces of his unit standing in the rain, each one carrying the grief of losing a brother. The mournful notes of taps hanging in the cold air. That world of sacrifice and honor was something my father and sister would never understand, a world where loyalty was lived, not used as leverage. And yet those very people had profited from his death while I was left with folded fabric, an empty bed, and a promise that would bind me for years. I sat at the edge of the bed and closed my eyes, and the antiseptic smell of the hospital came rushing back. I could still hear James's weak voice through the ventilator tubes in the ICU 3 years ago, his final words the honest wish of a man who believed in the goodness of family because he'd never met mine. He squeezed my hand and whispered, "Take care of them." That single request became the chain my father used to control me for years. He memorized it. Rehearsed it. Every time I tried to refuse their demands, he'd drop James's name like a weapon. "James wanted you to look after us," he'd say, feigning grief, and I'd cave again in the name of a dead man's honor. The worst memory surfaced, 3 weeks after burying James. Before the flowers on his grave had wilted, my father called in a manufactured panic about a foreclosure, claiming they'd be homeless within 2 days. He never asked how I was holding up. He called because the money had stopped. I remembered standing in the bank in my funeral clothes, eyes swollen from crying, signing over $50,000, nearly all of my husband's death benefit and my own savings, to buy them a house. They took the deed without a flicker of concern for me. Olivia was texting on her phone while I signed the paperwork. My father folded the deed and patted his jacket pocket like a man closing a good deal. They saw my husband's death not as a tragedy but as an opportunity, and I paid $50,000 3 weeks after burying the only man who ever loved me without conditions. I stood up and turned to face the mirror. The reflection looking back wasn't a grieving widow anymore, wasn't a fearful daughter chasing approval from people who only saw dollar signs. It was a decorated commander with 15 years of service and a spine forged under real pressure. I took a slow breath, holding it for a count of 4, and let the weight of that old promise finally leave my body. James believed they were worth saving. He was wrong, and I wouldn't keep paying for that mistake with my peace of mind. I turned the flag case to face the wall. The chapter of endless sacrifice was over. The next morning I walked onto the naval base, and the crisp salutes and respectful greetings from passing sailors washed over me like something healing. Every one of those voices carried respect earned through performance, not extracted through guilt. The smell of coffee and gun oil grounded me instantly. This was home, discipline, mutual respect, absolute clarity about rank and mission, people who'd take a bullet for each other without expecting payment. Everything my own family refused to offer me. Here I was judged on skill and results, not on how much money I could hand over. The contrast between the loyalty of strangers in uniform and the betrayal of my own blood made my jaw tighten. I sat down at my desk and pulled up my contacts. My thumb hovered over the name Michael Vance, a former military attorney turned real estate lawyer, my closest friend outside the chain of command. I remembered the ordeal years earlier when a falsified report threatened to end my career, and how he tore the case apart in 3 days flat, never once asking for anything in return. He simply said that's what family does, the family you choose, forged in hard circumstances rather than shared DNA. I called him. The plan was beginning. My mind moved next to Ethan Wright, a former electronic warfare specialist and old neighbor with clearance most officials would envy. I remembered the night he fixed a corrupted server for me under an impossible deadline, no questions asked, risking his own career for a fellow officer. He was a man of quiet precision and total loyalty who treated every obstacle like a target to be neutralized. I sent him a short message. His reply came back in seconds, ready. I sat back and organized the paperwork on the Tahoe property into a neat stack, the deed, tax records, renovation receipts, insurance documents, all in my name alone. Every document was a piece of ammunition. The loneliness from the night before had disappeared. I wasn't fighting this battle by myself anymore. I had people who understood loyalty in a way my relatives never learned. I looked at the deed with my name printed clearly on it and thought about how my father believed he'd taken an empty, undefended house. He had no idea he'd just picked a fight with a fully operational team. A few nights later I was in the command center reviewing shipping routes when my phone buzzed. My father's name lit up the screen. I answered, holding on to a faint, foolish hope for an apology. Instead his voice came through full of arrogance. "Listen up, Lauren. I've taken the villa back. It's going to Olivia's family for good. They move in this week." No request, no discussion, just a decree, as though my name on the deed were a clerical error he was generously correcting. "You're military," he snapped. "You live on base. Everything's covered for you. You don't have a husband, kids, or your own family. Why do you need that house? Give it to your sister, she needs a good place to raise her kids." Every word was calculated to make me feel disposable. My jaw locked as memories of the gambling bailout and the SUV burned through my mind. Then he brought up James. "That's your duty," he said. "Before he died, he told you to take care of us. You're breaking your promise to him." The mug in my hand shattered from the pressure of my grip, the handle snapping off, shards slicing into my palm. Blood dripped onto the floor. The pain barely registered. Hearing my dead husband's name used as a crowbar by a man who never served a day in his life hurt far worse than any cut. I pressed the phone to my ear and spoke low, the tone I used to silence hostile negotiators. "There will be no more concessions. This conversation is finished." I hung up while blood ran between my fingers. 2 days later, my phone rang again while I reviewed logistics with my bandaged hand tucked behind my back. It was Olivia, sobbing on cue, the same performance she'd been perfecting since childhood. "Please don't do this to Dad," she pleaded. "His blood pressure. We're struggling. David can't find work. The kids are crying. You're an officer, you don't understand what it's like. We're sisters, blood is thicker than water." I could hear David feeding her lines in the background. It was a scripted, coordinated push for money, nothing more. I stood still, staring at a blinking radar screen, completely unmoved. "Are you finished crying?" I asked flatly. The sobbing stopped immediately, and her true voice snapped through, sharp and entitled. "Why are you so heartless? Dad's made his decision. We move in Sunday whether you like it or not. You have no right to stop this." I looked at my bandaged hand and felt my own pulse, steady, in control. "Try it," I said, "and every choice has consequences." I ended the call. The compliant, guilt-ridden version of me was gone for good. The next morning, before sunrise, I stood in front of the mirror in my quarters, buttoning my uniform, every medal in place, each one a record of sacrifice these people would never understand. Then, methodically, I deleted every guilt-laced text, every manipulative voicemail, every photo that included my father and sister. 15 years of emotional leverage erased in minutes. I couldn't afford sentimentality while preparing for what was coming. Using saved leave, I went straight to Michael Vance's office and dropped a stack of deeds, statements, and records on his desk. I need to build a legal fortress around everything I own, I told him. My own family is coming for it. He looked through the documents with the focus of someone defusing a bomb. He defended soldiers and prosecuted corrupt officers, but he told me that afternoon that a parent exploiting his own child's grief was worse than anything he'd seen in a courtroom. We spent 6 hours closing every loophole, revoking every access my father had ever had to my finances, building walls too high for anyone to climb. That weekend, Olivia's outburst on the phone had accidentally handed me the exact information I needed, their move-in date. I locked myself in a quiet briefing room and spread the blueprints of the Tahoe house across a table. A text came in from Olivia, a photo of 4 packed suitcases with the caption, "See you Sunday, sis." I looked at it for a few seconds, felt the last of my hesitation fade, and picked up a marker. I wasn't sketching cozy furniture arrangements. I was mapping sensor placements, sound zones, and disorientation points throughout the house, non-lethal deterrent measures designed to overwhelm intruders. Every room became part of the plan. Early the next morning I drove to Ethan's place on the edge of town, his yard cluttered with old radio gear. I spread the marked-up blueprints across his table and briefed him on the plan. He grinned like someone finally let off a leash, and for the next 2 days we transformed the house into a fully wired installation, running cable through the walls, installing strobe lighting calibrated for maximum disorientation, and mounting directional sound emitters in the ceiling. By evening on the second day, everything was primed, linked to a single command I could trigger remotely from my laptop in San Diego. Before leaving, I mounted a reflective warning sign on the front door, "Automated surveillance area, enter at your own risk." It was the last clear chance for anyone to walk away. Then I packed up and left the house waiting in silence. On the day they arrived, I sat in my dark apartment watching 3 camera feeds. Right on schedule, the SUV pulled into the driveway. My father climbed out first, chest puffed with pride, surveying the property like a conqueror. Olivia and David hauled suitcases from the trunk, laughing. My stepmother Susan marched up the steps behind them, spotted the warning sign, and ripped it off the door in disgust, tossing it into the dirt. My father laughed it off. "Ignore it," he said, "she's just upset about losing the argument." David fumbled the door open and all 4 of them walked in, dragging suitcases across floors I had refinished myself. I watched them disappear inside, my finger resting near the command key. They'd had their warning. They chose to ignore it. That night, around 10, thermal cameras showed all 4 of them settled into bed, unaware of the wiring running beneath the floor. I took a slow breath, lifted my coffee, and let the memory of everything they'd taken over 15 years settle any remaining hesitation. There was no guilt left, only the calm focus of someone finishing a plan they'd built carefully. I pressed the key. Instantly the house lit up with disorienting strobe lighting in every room, alarms blaring through the mountains, low-frequency sound designed to trigger panic, and the sprinklers activating in a freezing spray. I watched through the silent feeds as my father rolled off the bed in shock, Susan crawled through the flashing hallways sobbing, and Olivia and David scrambled for the door only to find it electronically sealed. There was no way out, a direct consequence of tearing down the warning they'd been given. For 6 hours I watched their arrogance dissolve into exhaustion and fear, every scream a small repayment for everything they'd taken from me. I didn't look away once. At dawn, the system disengaged on its timer and the doors unlocked. All four of them stumbled out onto the lawn, soaked, pale, and hoarse. My phone rang almost immediately. My father, his voice stripped of its usual authority, just a frightened man who'd spent the night trapped by his own greed. I answered with a calm, faintly sarcastic tone. Sorry, must be a glitch in the security system. It recognizes the actual owner. Try not to break into someone else's house next time. Have a good morning. I hung up before he could respond. The next morning, my cameras caught David bringing a locksmith to the door, gesturing frantically. But faced with the scorched wiring and obvious security overhaul, the locksmith backed off and left without touching the lock. David stood alone on the porch, realizing he was up against something he couldn't overpower. Unable to force their way back in, they turned to their last option, threatening my career. That night, pounding on my apartment door woke the building. I opened it already expecting them. My father and Olivia stood there, still shaken from the night before, but furious. He jabbed a finger at me and threatened to report me for abuse, to destroy my reputation and rank. Olivia called me a monster and said they'd cut me off completely unless I signed the house over to them as compensation for their supposed suffering. The nerve of it, breaking into my legally owned property after tearing down a warning sign, then demanding I pay them for it. They still believed I was the same person who'd caved to protect the peace. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, calm and unmoved. Are you two finished? I asked. Go ahead and report me. But you'll need to prove ownership first. This is over, my way. I shut the door on them. The next day, we all sat in the office of a senior notary named William Hayes, a former military intelligence officer. My father, Susan, Olivia, and David walked in like they'd already won, certain that the threat to my career had forced me to the table. My father slammed his hand on the table and demanded I sign the transfer papers by that afternoon or he'd send a complaint to my command. I sat across from them in full uniform, sipping my tea, unbothered. William slid a sealed document to the center of the table. I'm sorry, he said, but Commander Martin can't transfer the property. She no longer owns it. The room went silent. My father's face went white. What do you mean? He stammered. I leaned forward. Last Monday, I donated the entire property to a veterans support fund. The agreement is permanent, and in exchange I retain lifetime use of the house. Everything they had planned, fought for, and schemed over vanished in a single sentence. There was nothing left to sue for, nothing to transfer. Susan gasped and grabbed her throat. David sat frozen. My father tried to stand and collapsed back into his chair. Olivia broke down into real tears, forehead against the table. William simply gathered the documents, unmoved. He delivered worse news in harder rooms. They had gambled everything on manipulating a Navy commander, and they had lost completely. A few days later, I drove back up to Tahoe alone, windows down, breathing air that finally felt like mine. I spent the morning removing the strobe lights, packing away the sound equipment, patching the walls, mopping the floors until the water ran clear. Room by room, the house returned to normal. The conflict was over, and the people who'd caused it were gone from my life for good. No more late-night calls, no more guilt trips invoking my husband's memory, no more bailouts or unearned gifts. Every financial obligation they'd placed on me for 15 years was gone, settled permanently with legal paperwork and the backing of the Navy. The house now belonged to people who'd actually earned it, and I would live there for the rest of my life under a contract nothing could undo. I walked out onto the same deck where my father once stood popping champagne and declaring my eviction, coffee in hand, morning light spreading over the lake. I stood exactly where he had stood and felt nothing, no anger, no grief, just the quiet absence of a weight I'd carried since I was old enough to write a check. I took a deep breath of clean mountain air, fuller than any I'd taken in 15 years. The burden was gone. I was a commander, I was free, and this house was finally mine to enjoy in peace. This kind of manipulation only survives in silence. Standing firm and drawing a clear line ends its power for good. If this story felt like a victory to you, consider liking and subscribing, and share your own story in the comments. Has anyone in your life ever pushed you too far? And how did you finally push back?